Also, I need to
now being live streamed.
Hi. Excellent. Hi, everybody. This is Megan Finn coming to you tonight. And I'm over the moon that we have some special guests. After our presentation of Los Niños Perdidos, which is a collaboration with ID Studio, we have a wonderful panel tonight to kind of talk about some of the themes of the show, and how they are, how we can learn a little more about immigration policy to date and what's happening right now with the current administration and what actions folks out there can take. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to just introduce our panelists quickly. They're all rock stars, so that's what you'll know to start with. We'll start with Denise Bell, who's a researcher on refugee and migrant rights at Amnesty International USA. She is the author of a number of reports on the issue and has led missions in the US and Middle East. Her portfolio also covers climate displacement, COVID-19, technology, corporate accountability, and the right to peaceful protest. She served as a senior campaigner for refugee and migrant rights at Amnesty USA, campaigner for its Darfur campaign. She was previously with the US Department of Justice as an attorney advisor on the New York Immigration Court and has worked on forced displacement issues since the mid-1990s. Thank you, Denise, for being here. We're also joined by Casey Revkin of Every Last One. Casey is a co-founder of Every Last One, a nonprofit dedicated to expediting the release of immigrant children from detention and federal custody foster care in the United States. She has served as the California director of Immigrant Families Together, a national rapid response fund dedicated to reunited immigrant families separated at the US-Mexico border. Full disclosure, I also am a co-founder of Every Last One. So thank you, Casey, for being here tonight. We also have Paula Luisi of Families Belong Together, who has over a decade of experience in the progressive politics, campaigning, and storytelling. Before joining Families Belong Together, she was the communications director for the International Planned Parenthood Federation's Western Hemisphere, where she worked on reproductive health and rights across Latin America. She's a veteran of the Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama presidential campaigns, has a master's degree in foreign policy from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She has a bachelor's degree. I bet you remember that fondly. Your time back then.
I didn't realize you were going to read all of it.
I know, but it's fun. It's fun. In history and economics from the University of Maryland, and she's traveled to over 30 countries and is a proud first generation Uruguayan American, and is objectively a terrible but avid CrossFitter, which I think we need to know, which is a very tanky fact. So just to set the mood, it's a very tanky fact. So I'm really thrilled to have you all here. I think for those who are tuning in and seeing us on the social medias, there's another screening of Los Niños Perdidos tomorrow night. It is a wonderful production. And one thing that I think is particularly helpful about it, as not just a piece of art, but also as a tool of learning. If you know nothing about the experience of asylum seekers, it really does lay out very clearly the difficulty that particularly children have when they're put into detention and then have to kind of are questioned in order to have their asylum even considered. So I think it kind of maps out the whole that whole experience very clearly. So I encourage anybody listening who hasn't checked it out to check it out. But I wanted to say, this is an issue that that really came in a kind of broader spotlight during the Trump administration, and particularly around the zero tolerance policy and the separation of children from their parents. But obviously, this is an ongoing issue, and there's a systemic issue beyond that. But maybe we could start with you, Denise. Denise has, with Amnesty, authored a really wonderful report that we'll also share with viewers, that outlines kind of a report card for the current administration. So can you kind of bring us up to speed maybe on a few things? Maybe we'll start how you do in regular parent-teacher conferences when you're talking about a report card. Maybe a few positive things. So what can we look at in the current administration that maybe is different from the Trump administration and have been steps forward in the right direction?
Well, thank you, Megan. I'm so pleased to be here and talking with Paola and Casey. It's and also a shout out to the Tank, which is a fabulous theater. So what we're seeing is I do think that we need to give credit where credit is due. The Biden administration is a very different administration. The president pledged to center human rights and racial justice, pledged to do a number of things to roll back anti-asylum policies. And he really has started off in a promising way with a series of executive orders that he signed, new regulations or proposed regulations or considerations of regulations to implement those. And what I think is and there are a number of concerns, but we do have to put this in the setting of this administration inherited a broken system. It was one that was deliberately broken by the previous administration. It doesn't mean that it was awesome before President Trump, but the previous administration set out to deliberately dismantle the system of protection for people seeking safety. And then through deliberate and gross negligence, refused to plan in ways that were foreseeable for arrivals of people in this administration. And at the same time, no government can escape its human rights obligations. So yes, you're set up with a horrible situation, but you still have responsibilities to follow US law and your human rights obligations. So for many things, the administration is in progress, mixed review. So let's start unaccompanied children. They undertook a whole of government response to meet the higher number of arrivals of unaccompanied children, moving them out of Border Patrol stations into temporary facilities for unaccompanied children called emergency intake sites. That was unprecedented what they did. They were very nimble, they were innovative. That was an emergency response in March, and now we're in June. And we should not be here. And that's the sort of thing. Like, good, do better, it's mixed. Refugee resettlement. This is the thing that was very alarming. The president made a commitment to admit 62,500 refugees. Fantastic. But then after going to Congress and saying this is what we would do, he walked it back and set President Trump's limit of 15,000 refugees. After instantaneous and consistent outcry, the president walked that back to his original promise. That's disturbing. Why did he do that? He needed to hear, and this is the positive of it, he needed to hear that there's a deep bench for refugee resettlement. Also that there's support. But so we're getting mixed signals. You sign a lot of executive orders rescinding bad policy. You take steps to rebuild a system, and then you kind of stall. But I do want to credit, and I think that we need to credit the steps that have been taken and what we need to do to make progress, like the Family Reunification Task Force. I do think that that is pretty unprecedented for the government to acknowledge the error and the harm that it caused and to seek to find ways to provide redress. I think that we all would like things to move faster. I think that we would like a lot of permanent solutions that aren't there. But I do think that this is a serious undertaking by an administration to recognize the harms that it deliberately caused. I mean, Amnesty International found family separation we documented cases where we said this amounted to torture. Like, this is extraordinary for a government to say we did wrong and we're going to try to repair the harm as best we can. Of course we want more. So I do want to acknowledge in the areas there is improvement. Temporary protected status. It took a long time to get a new designation for Haiti. We shouldn't have had to wait that long.
Can you break that down for folks that might not understand and for the temporary protected status? And then I'm gonna ask you, Paula, if you can talk a little bit about kind of what FBT's priorities have been, particularly around the task force. But could you just, Denise, break down what that means for folks, for folks with that status?
Yep. And so for temporary protected status, it's the government, the Department of Homeland Security designates a people nationality for basically temporary protected status in the US where they cannot be deported. They have a conditional permission to live in the United States. And it's because of armed conflict, extraordinary circumstances, or environmental disaster. And it does not lead to permanent status, and that's a separate conversation, but it is a form of humanitarian protection against forced return. You already need to be in the United States, so you can't come here and ask for TPS. You have to be here, but it is a mechanism to provide protection against forced return. We had been advocating for months and months and months for Haiti to be redesignated. Again, we were grateful. I mean, I do think that's the word, because it's an act of discretion. Disturbed that it took this much work. The end result is there. That's why there's a mixed record. That's why Amnesty International says needs improvement. I mean, there are two areas, and we can talk about later, where we're like rapidly going in the wrong direction. You need an immediate course correction. Detention and Title 42, and we'll get to that later. But these other areas, I do think that we have to acknowledge they're making progress. They're going in the right direction. They need to do much more, but it's disappointing that we've had to press again and again to get them across the finish line in some areas.
Paula, can you talk, maybe if you want to, about why you think that's happening? Why you think that it is more difficult to get these things done? And then also, if my other question that I was prepped, which is like, what are the focuses for Families Belong Together right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And also, thanks so much for having me tonight. Super excited. So I think that at stake here, if we take a step back, so I think that's important, is how we as a nation are going to treat children and families and people who are running for their lives. So there is this notion that we have this false choice as a nation. Like, either we fall into these ridiculous alt-right, because frankly, it is an alt-right narrative, that it's like either border or torture. You know what I mean? It's like either we invest a ton of money into militarization and we torture children and families, because I'm sorry, but ripping a literal infant out of a mother's arms, which is exactly what happened under the Trump administration, is torture, not just for the child, who likely has it has a huge psychological impact, but also for the parents in the longer term. I mean, could you imagine literally having a child ripped from your arms, not having any idea what happened to that child, how long you're not going to see them for? I mean, we have to take a step back and like actually think about what we're talking here. And I think that's important, because I think sometimes it gets lost in the mix, in addition to the fact it's a pandemic, in addition to the fact we just coming out from under the Trump administration, which was like a whole lot to unpack there, to say the least. But I always sort of start with that, because I think that piece is really important. So for us, to bring it back to your question, you know, the Biden administration has brought together a task force, an interagency task force, bringing in the Department of State, bringing in the Department of Homeland Security, bringing in the Department of Justice, to make sure that, you know, we not only find all the children who were impacted, because again, like what keeps me up at night is like, we don't know what we don't know. And like everything that we found out under the Trump administration was found out thanks to journalists and like other groups, not only within the Families Belong Together Coalition, but beyond, we don't know what we don't know. So like they have to go back through these awful records to make sure that the numbers are right, first of all. And second of all, do everything humanly possible to put the United States government's resources behind finding these children and families, right? We're almost 4 years out from the initial pilot program for when this happened. So we're talking about at least hundreds of kids. We're not talking dozens. I'm talking about hundreds of kids who have not seen their parents or guardians in over almost 4 years. So let's break that down for a second, right? Because I think it's important. In some cases, in what they call tender aged children, we're talking about like 2, 3, 4, 5. Some kids, when they are brought back together, don't even recognize their parents, you know? Like, let's sit back and think about what this government intentionally did to these families, because it was absolutely intentional. Some of these children are being reunited with folks that they don't necessarily recognize. So let's think through the trauma of that, right? So I think that's one piece. Another piece is also, what about the kids who may remember their parents, but you just lost 3 to 4 years of incredibly transformative years? I mean, think about an 11-year-old that goes to a 15-year-old or a 13-year-old that goes to a 17-year-old. I mean, these are massive chunks of people's lives back. So I think it's important because what we're talking about right now is that reunifications and the reunifications that are happening now are crucial, but it's the floor, not the ceiling. It's not like we're back together, everything is wonderful. No, like this is just the first step in a really long road to recovery. And the absolute very least that we can do as a nation is make sure that those families have all the resources they need, whether it's mental health services, whether it's making sure that they're not worried about, you know, ICE knocking on their door again, whether it is housing security. I mean, you name it. Like, frankly, in my mind, we should be rolling out the red carpet, and I don't want those families ever worry about anything ever again besides healing, right? And so I bring all of this up because I think it's important to frame this conversation to, one, not shy away of the horrors of what we're talking about, because it is actually horrific, because I think it's important to just say it. And then two, be really clear-eyed of the importance of what needs to happen next. So I know I don't want on a bit of a tangent there, but I do
important.
like to reframe us, because, you know, for those of us who like work in this every day, sometimes like we'll see it and then, you know, it's just like an important reminder of what the magnitude of what this is, and that this is going to take years to peel back.
I'm wondering, Casey, to kind of segue from that, and the you know, the thinking about this compounded trauma and not just of these zero tolerance families, which is horrific, but also kind of the ongoing separations that are happening due to Title 42 and other policies that just have created opportunities for children to be separated from their grandparents or an aunt or uncle who maybe is their guardian, is the person that they know as a parent. And there are these loopholes where these things happen. So maybe if you can talk about, one thing is Every Last One, just to give a sense of what Every Last One does, is kind of just fills a gap between the family and the system. So assists families in going through the process of having familial sponsors be able to get children released from detention and expedite that process, because they might not know where to start. They might not have access to a computer. They might not have transportation funds, whatever the case may be. So maybe, and you can talk about some of the recent work that Every Last One has done.
Yes, thank you. So that's what the main part of what we do is that there are kids who are detained and they have families who are confronted with this daunting process and don't know where to start. Or I often tell the story of the very first girl I helped. She was 4 years old. She came to the border with her grandmother right at the height of zero tolerance, but she came to a lawful point of entry, but because it was her grandmother and not her mother, they were automatically separated, and she was just 4. and her grandmother was processed and then released, and she was sent across the country to a facility in Pennsylvania. And her mother was already here in the US, and her mother was given this application to fill out to start to apply to get her daughter out. And she didn't have a computer and she didn't have a printer, so she went to like a Kinko's type place and got stuck because she didn't have the $50 to print that application and fax it in. And it doesn't cost you or me $50, but my original reaction was like, oh, I have $50, like I can fix this, but it actually shouldn't be like that. So one of the things that we do is we help these families fill out these applications, because we have computers and we have scanners and we have things to help them fill them out and then send it in a nice complete package. That little girl was kept for 47 days. We did help her fill out the application. We did help the family fulfill everything. Every time that like another request came from the government, we helped them fulfill it, and they still were holding her. And what we ended up doing is buying the mom a plane ticket to Pennsylvania and like alerting the press and a local senator. And suddenly they said, oh, never mind. And they put her on the next plane to California. But it shouldn't have to be like this. Families shouldn't need other organizations to buy them plane tickets to confront them, and we shouldn't have to get the press involved. Denise talked a little bit earlier about these emergency influx centers. There was a huge influx of children coming to the border, and there were not enough beds for them in the traditional facilities. I think it's worth noting that kids are kept in a completely different division. They're not held by Department of Homeland Security. They're kept by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is a division of HHS. And HHS only had beds for 13,000 kids, and there were something like 22,000 kids. And the Biden's administration's response was to build these emergency sites, which was a smart idea. And on the one hand, we should applaud them for responding so quickly. And on the other hand, we have to take some points away because they could have done a better job. Like, these facilities were unlicensed, and some of these unlicensed facilities hired inappropriate people to take care of these children. The BBC just reported on Monday these horrible conditions at Fort Bliss, which is this military base that was converted to take care of children with, in one instance, the girls' tent became so rampant with lice that they just shut it down and sent all the staff home. But these girls were just stuck in this tent without any staff overlooking them. Kids there isn't enough underwear for the kids. It's this place in the middle of the desert with sandstorms, and they're just kept in tents. They could have found a better place probably to put these kids. And that facility is still open. And I think it's on us to talk about that and address that and say, we want better solutions, more humane solutions for these children.
Denise, can you talk about Title 42 and kind of COVID as a smoke screens at points during this process? Sorry if you disagree with that characterization, but COVID is the ultimate excuse for some of this. I mean, I understand in an initial standpoint, yes, you're saying emergency in March, but here we are in June. Can you talk about Title 42?
I love smokescreen. I mean, I think all of us in this space, smokescreen, pretext. I think I say dubious rationale. I say a lot of things about this, but Title 42 is basically an obscure public health quarantine that in March 2020, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention used to issue a rule that then the Department of Health and Human Services used to close the border. DHS that's the Department of Health and Homeland Security, has subsequently used this order to close the southern border to asylum seekers and people who are seeking entry who don't have a visa, which are, again, asylum seekers or other people seeking safety. And the rationale was, again, last year, March 2020, that it was unsafe and not not urgent business, basically, a priority for people coming to seek safety to enter the border. So we closed the border. Now, never mind that millions of people continue to cross the border. The rationale was we couldn't admit them because there wasn't space and ability to provide them protective measures and Customs and Border Patrol. Public health, okay, but the reporting, this is what's very important to understand the bogus rationale. Reporting indicated that Centers for Disease and Control Prevention, CDC, senior officials disagreed with this rationale. It was a political decision that came from the White House. Public health experts have repeatedly said that there is no scientific rationale for using this public health quarantine against only asylum seekers. Millions of people continue to cross the southern border. And so at this point, what we've seen is over 875,000 people have been summarily expelled since last year. Over 400,000 of them under the Biden administration. The Biden administration has heard us loud and clear. They've let us know, but they keep saying this is a CDC decision in the public health interest. And we're like, that is absolutely false. You're using COVID-19 as cover to achieve, under the Trump administration, to achieve a policy objective they couldn't achieve in every other way that they tried to close the border to people seeking asylum. Here, it's a form of border control. And I'm sure there are a number of reasons that they would say that they wouldn't acknowledge. Now, what we'd like to say, the Biden administration exempted unaccompanied children from coming. They didn't have to do that. So that's important. That is good. And they're also exempting particularly vulnerable populations, which has a very vague categorization, like category. So that is good that people are being admitted. However, that doesn't absolve the government of actually upholding its human rights obligations and US law, which is to give people their lawful and legal right to ask for asylum. Like, this is actually a stain on their record. They could end this, but they are not.
So yeah, this is something this is a question I have because, I think without getting in the weeds, for instance, on the task force, there are lots of legal things that impede swift progress, right? For these zero tolerance families. When we talk about detention and the idea of ending detention, which is in your report card, Denise, it's a violation of international asylum law, detention. And yet it is a whole system in the United States. So what does it take to make that happen? It's Congress. What does it take?
It's Congress and it's policy. The administration could change this through policy. And it's very simple. I mean, it's so astonishing simple. Start with a presumption of liberty. All people are entitled to a presumption of liberty. And just because you're an immigrant, just because you're an asylum seeker, doesn't mean that you no longer have a presumption of liberty. So if you enter the United States, it shouldn't be like, oh my gosh, we're going to detain you because you crossed a border to ask for safety. It should be like, you're another human being. The presumption is liberty. And we will allow you to live in the community through community-based support as you navigate the immigration system with your claim to ask for asylum. What we find is that again and again and again, people are categorically seen as threats because they cross the border and ask for asylum, which then dehumanizes them and reflects the systemic racism in the immigration detention system. It's unnecessary and it's cruel. Congress, like through the Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act, that would radically reset the detention system. The administration, through a series of policy decisions, could just turn over the immigration detention system and write into policy a presumption of liberty, and then refer people out to community-based programs. It's very simple. It's not magic.
Paula, can you talk about, well, you can talk about what you want to, But also, can you talk about what some of the focus of Families Belong Together in terms of specific things that are before Congress that folks out there should know about, who can and who they should be talking to?
Yeah. So there are a lot of things that people can do to get involved. So I think that is something that I always say to folks, because again, like these are very large issues. Like what Denise is talking about is the fact that our nation is addicted to punishment. You know, we see that through mass incarceration. We see that through the role of private prisons that aren't only just like in the immigration space, but also absolutely in, you know, the other space, even though there's some movement on that when it comes to DOJ, but that progress is mixed. It's not as easy as it sounds. But sort of back to your original question in terms of what's in front of Congress now, like number one, like one thing that I always like to say is like family separation was not an aberration. You know, it is a product of a system that is built upon punishment, and it is built upon a presumption of criminality, which is wrong. We're talking about families who are just like mine, who, like any other parent, you know, if your kid is in danger, you're going to run, period. It's not that much harder than that. You know, like what I'm trying to break down, and again, what Denise said, and like the dehumanization of the people who are at the border, is that they're no different than any other human, and any other human who is under threat. I mean, let me tell you, if like my niece and my nephews were threatened, you can bet that I would move heaven and earth to make something happen. I don't know what, but I would make it happen. That's no different than the people that we were talking about, right? But to bring it back, what's like currently right in front of Congress, there is the Families Belong Together Act, which is incredibly important, which has been introduced in the House. And what the Families Belong Together Act does is that it provides not only like a pathway to citizenship for these families who've been impacted, but also mental health services, like long-term resources, mental health services, among other things, right? What's happening right now with the task force is the families that are being reunited have something called humanitarian parole, which is like a fancy word for saying you get to hang out for 3 years, right? But any psychologist that I talk to or psychiatrist will say, like, again, going back on the long road to healing, what we need to do to make sure those conditions are ideal for families to heal is to make sure that they have stability. And like, what kind of stability do you have if you know that like 3 years is not actually that long if you're trying to plan out, you know, sort of life that you're talking about? And then like, what responsibility do we have as a nation, you know, to these families that we purposefully, sadistically, because it was literal sadism in action, tore apart? So the Families Belong Together Act is really important because yes, the Biden administration has done an executive order to create the task force, but at the end of the day, we have to do more. And so for anybody who's listening right now, I would call your congressperson, I would call your senator and tell them that they need to sponsor the Families Belong Together Act. There are also a number of other immigration bills that are currently on the Hill that I think are really important to mention because, again, family separation was the product, right, of a system that was working intentionally. It was the extension, you know, of a system that has been broken. There are 5 million families who have at least one person undocumented within their nuclear family, meaning there are 5 million people who live amongst us. They are your neighbors, they are your friends, they are nurses, they are doctors, who in addition to being foundations and incredibly important members of our communities, also live in constant fear of coming home to an empty house. I went down to Mississippi after the massive raid that happened in Jackson under the Trump administration, okay? It happened on the first day of school, okay? 600 agents, I'm not joking, 600 agents, 2 helicopters, among other things, went out and hit a bunch of poultry plants. 687 people were ripped away from their families that day on the first day of school, okay? So like, it was a total catastrophe. Going down there, I felt like was going into an area that was like a natural disaster. I mean, we're talking about kids who came home, nobody's home. Could you imagine just like the terror of what that's like? You had neighbors coming out. We had to go and help out a mom who literally just grabbed all the kids. She was taking care of 9 kids under the age of 10 for her neighbors and her block because nobody was home. I mean, it was like they went in and just devastated a community. So the reason I bring that up is like, yes, like family separation was horrific and it was literal torture and it was sadism, but it is not an aberration, right? The Trump administration militarized and took it to the next level. But that's not to say that there aren't 5 million people within our communities who live with this fear on the regular. All of it is wrong. So like, we have to pass the Families Belong Together Act. We have to throw down with the We Are Home campaign, which is the national campaign to pass immigration reform this year for the 11 million people, many of whom are essential workers, and their lines were on the line to make sure that we were fed, that our kids were taken care of, that hospitals were getting cleaned. I mean, let's be real here about what we're talking about. And so I think this is a pivotal moment, not only just for the Hill and for Congress and also the administration, but like for us as a nation to come together on the heels of sort of coming out of this pandemic on how we want to treat each other and how we do right by those we have wronged. So again, I would say, call your senators, call your congressmen and women, people, tell them to pass the Families Belong Together Act, tell them that we need immigration reform this year.
It's really important that it happens swiftly. And I think don't take for granted if you're thinking you need to figure out what your Congress people are doing, because just because they might be left-leaning doesn't mean they're signed on to these bills. Does not mean that they're prioritizing this. And I think so check, go and reach out and find and make sure they do it. And we'll put information, we'll connect folks with that information so we can. Casey, I know maybe you could just speak about, what you would see as policy priorities. And, I think the work Every Last One has been doing particularly in the last 6 months has been incredible. Again, as you say, it shouldn't be something that they have to do. It shouldn't even exist. But in light of it, I think 69, you assisted in the expedited release of 69 children in May alone. So
we did, you and me, Megan.
I know, but I'm just saying, I wasn't tooting my horn on this. I'm tooting your horn. But can you talk about what you would see as things that the administration could do now that would make your life easier?
So one thing that we came up with that we think could make a huge difference in thousands of lives of children, and that is not really being talked about, is that half the kids who are currently detained have a parent already in the US. And that's from the DHS's or HHS's own statistics, that half the kids have a parent already in the US. And if you go back to my story of the 4-year-old girl from under the Trump administration, where it took 47 days and like moving heaven and earth, like her mom was already here. It should have been so simple to say, this is her mom, this is the daughter, we've proved it, we've looked at the birth certificate, we've called the consulate, we've verified the birth certificate is correct, we've verified the ID is real, and just release her to them. And they could do that today. Like Biden could enact this policy change on his own. He doesn't need Congress to say that when parents are in the US, they don't have to go through this long 22-day, 47-day, they don't have to go through this long, weeks-long, months-long process. They don't have to figure out how to print a 20-page application and send it in and check a bunch of boxes. They should just verify the parental relationship and release the kids to their sponsors. They could take the 14,000 kids that are detained right now and bring that down to 7,000. And then there would be enough beds in, so they wouldn't have to have any of these emergency intake sites. So we created, we talk about it on our website. We created a ResistBot petition about it. Also for the Families Belong Together Act, ResistBot is this like cool little app that you can text them and you can send messages to your representatives. It's 50409 and you can text Go Reunite. And that sends the message that you believe children should be released to their parents immediately. And Go FBT says sign on to the Families Belong Together Act because they need those support. So
wait, can you just repeat that Families Belong Together Act? So what do they text?
It's Go FBT as in Families Belong Together to 50409.
50409.
And you can find ResistBot on Twitter or Facebook or something and just message them there too.
I'm grateful for all of your brains. I think that in particular, something that's synergy for me, hearing Paola, you talk about the kind of trying to get your head around the actual things that are happening to people. And that's the thing, you know, in terms of a media literacy around anything that comes out about the border, that's challenging for folks, right? You got to kind of cut through that chaos that's kind of the spin of that, and really come down to think about what this is person to person. It's about a mom with taking care of all of her neighbors' kids. It's your neighbors' kids. It's your neighbors. It's, you know, it's a mom having a baby ripped from her. It's a grandma at the border crossing with her 4-year-old and having the 4-year-old taken from. And we have to, that's something that was very clear for zero tolerance, but we don't think it's not some of these other issues, detention, people are waiting in line to go to jail. Like, I don't think that people don't have that same kind of connection when they think about it. And I think a lot of it, I think you might bring the point that Amnesty is making, that detention is a violation of international law, that is an institution in the United States, because it's often these words, legal, illegal, legal, illegal. And as soon as something is shrouded in illegal, you lose that narrative. You lose that mom taking care of her neighbor's kids, and suddenly I don't want to get in trouble. You know, oh, you're doing something against the law. Denise, as we're kind of moving forward, what would you say people can do from your perspective?
First, I would just like to say quickly, the illegal legal dichotomy. I was just asked by a journalist at a high profile media outlet, what about people crossing illegally? And I was like, nobody's crossing illegally. Nobody's illegal. Nobody's crossing illegally. Everybody has the right to cross a border. It's not only international human rights law. Anybody can cross the border. It doesn't matter if you present yourself at a port of entry, as we say, or cross between them, you can still ask for asylum. Now, we might criminalize that, but there is nothing illegal in the act of asking for asylum. I was on an immigration court for 3 years with the Department of Justice. Everybody who came through could ask for asylum. It didn't matter how they entered the country. But I just want to flag that, like, it makes me so angry, because it goes back again to how we are categorically dehumanizing people because they cross a border and ask for safety. And our law says that they can do that. So what is wrong with us as a country that we say that something is illegal about this when our law permits it? And what people can do, besides international human rights law that says that you can do that, everybody has the right to seek asylum, is go to amnestyusa.org. And on our homepage, if you scroll down, you'll see free people from ICE detention. And in there, you will see all of our actions, calling on the President and Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, Mayorkas, to free people from detention, to end contracts for for-profit prisons who run these detention centers, to support community-based solutions instead of detention. You'll also see our actions calling for the passage of the Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act, which is a radical transformation of the detention system, and also the Families Liberation Act, which is going to end family detention. So these are concrete ways that we are looking for the administration to reform, reset the system, and also for Congress to act in ways that it can to make sure that nobody is unjustly detained, and that people seeking asylum, people seeking safety here, can do that with safety and dignity.
Well, thank you, all of you. I think the more go to these sites, text, contact your representatives, the more you can kind of get out of the various smoke screens around these issues. This is a solvable problem. This is a solvable situation. It is not a out of control chaos. It is like, we could fix this. It's a disgusting stain on our country, and we could fix it in our lifetime. So be encouraged by that. You know, this isn't just about the tragedy of that. This is within the people's power to change. You just have to kind of open their mind a bit and take some action. So on that note, thank you all for being here. You're the best. You're the greatest. And thanks for people tuning in to this, and to ID Studio and to the Tank. And yeah, thanks so much for being here, guys.
Thanks for having us. I really appreciate it.
Take care now.
Bye-bye.